so I've got all this negativity about Mr. G's church, and I moved to Chicago, and now Willow Creek's this completely different environment, and I'm writing letters to my brother-in-law, and I'm venting and processing it all. At Willow Creek had a completely different set of priorities, and it was very educational to be in this completely different environment. And so one of the things I ended up doing was something called a seeker small group. A seeker small group is basically a Bible study for non-Christians, where nobody gets to assume that they agree with any of this, right? And it's for people who are exploring Christianity. And for a long time, I ran the longest running seeker small group at Willow Creek. It was one of the first ones they ever started. And I kind of developed a reputation where they would send me the hard cases because I could handle them. And a seeker group, it was like chaos. Like, you get these people together at a table, and one of them is an ex-Catholic, and one of them is an atheist, and one of them is an agnostic, and one of them is a burned-out Protestant, and whatever, right? And it was extremely intense. And there was this group that I had for quite a while, and we decided, okay, let's read the first few chapters of Genesis, and let's just unpack it. And for some reason, I had the foresight to say to the group, I said, we're going to read this, and I don't care if you think it's literal or figurative or allegorical or somewhere in between. We're not going to be concerned about that. I just want you to read it. And we went through, and we just took it really slow. And we Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3, Genesis 4, the Cain and Abel, and Adam and Eve, and all that stuff. And within about 3, 4, 5 weeks, the whole group was just mesmerized. Because I think the first few chapters of Genesis, I would argue it's the richest piece of literature ever. There is so much depth to those stories. It is unbelievable. And you get into it, and there's more questions and more questions and more questions. And what you could see was, it started out with them reading the scriptures, but in time, the scripture was reading them. And you could see the change. And within a year, all of the people in that group decided that they wanted to have Christ in their life. And they all became Christians. And I think that if I had tried to ram a particular view of Genesis down their throats, it would have been disastrous. But instead, I just let it speak to them. And, I want to say this about those chapters, is each of those chapters is only the length of a blog post, but they reveal the questions, all the questions of humanity, the deepest questions of humanity are all in there. Okay? I mean, there's a reason why the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians consider that the origin story of humanity. And you never run out of ways to look at the scriptures. And then furthermore, you take other fields, other disciplines, and you bring them in. All it does is just show you more stuff. So, for example, very famously as of late, Jordan Peterson did this whole Psychology of the Biblical Stories series, which he's continuing, and he's coming at it from a completely different angle than anything I ever grew up with. I mean, he's talking about Dostoevsky and Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud and Rogers and evolutionary psychology, and doesn't matter. You put stuff in, and and he's got millennials just hanging on the edge of their seats listening to this. And so, like, these stories are incredibly powerful. And, but it's like C.S. Lewis said, you don't need to protect a lion. You just need to defend a lion. You just need to let him out of his cage. And I had the foresight to do that with that group of people. And so then, Bryan gets into his whole thing about doubt. Let me try to give you an idea what happened to him. So he goes to Master's Seminary in Southern California, which is John MacArthur's school. He gets a THM, which is essentially a master's degree. He knows Greek. He knows Hebrew. He moves to China. He's an undercover missionary part of the time. The other time, he's an English teacher, and he goes to work. And within a couple of years, he's starting to have doubts. And what's happened to Bryan is, the way I would describe it is, at his school, they gave him the exact Excel spreadsheet of all the answers. This is what all the verses means. This is eschatology. This is the history of the earth. This is our theology about Jesus. This is our theology about this. And it was all like really neat and packaged. He goes to China, and the ambiguities and challenges of China itself don't really fit what he's been told. And B, he can get on the internet and nobody can stop him from asking questions. Mm-hmm. And after a while, he's like, hey, wait a minute. The earth isn't 6,000 years old. What else are they not telling me? Like, I can easily figure out that the earth is not 6,000 years old. You can approach it from almost any discipline you can imagine. Anthropology, astronomy, cosmology, physics, biology, geology, drilling for oil for that, like, whatever. Earth is not 6,000 years old. Like, what else are they not telling me? And in fact, there was a point where he's reading the John MacArthur Study Bible, and it says, well, the earth was covered with this worldwide flood, and it completely changed everything around, so we can't have any knowledge of what the earth originally was like because now it's after the flood. And Bryan, it was at that point, Bryan picked up that Bible and he threw it across the room because he knew they were just making up their own version of science. That this did not fit any geological model that you can go verify by digging. Sure. That they were just gerrymandering science in order to make it fit a very particular reading of Genesis. And he had a bunch of questions, but like this whole thing really started unraveling. My parents, I asked my parents when I was 7 or 8, I said, how come you never told us about Santa Claus? Like, they never did the Santa Claus thing with us. And my dad said, well, if we told you about Santa Claus and then you found out that there was no Santa Claus, the next question would be, so what about Jesus? Did you make that up too? Well, Bryan kind of had a Santa Claus moment with science. It's like, sure. Like, okay, so the John Whitcomb Young Earth Creation version of science, not true. Demonstrably not true. So what about everything else? Right. And it just undercut the whole thing. And, and again, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but I think that's what the Young Earth Creation movement has done, is it has significantly undercut the credibility of the whole entire Christian story. And it comes to the way Bryan's the way it was all constructed. It was like, well, the whole Young Earth Creationist thing is, well, everything starts with Genesis, and you have to read it this particular way, and then if you do that, then we have everything all figured out. But then if you change any of these assumptions, it all falls apart. Well, that's actually an indication that you don't have a very robust system of belief to begin with, is because
you're waiting in a vacuum now.
It's because it's strung together with all of these little dependencies. Where even half of them are questionable, it doesn't work. Well, that's a warning sign.
So Bryan starts getting some doubt.
Yeah.
What is that? That obviously snowballs into something.
Well, so I had done all these secret groups with all of these people. I eventually moved my secret group to Borders Bookstore, and so now I'm getting anybody who wanders in. That was way more difficult than getting the ones that were filtered through Willow Creek.
Right.
I dealt with all kinds of people like that. There was a very smart guy named Mark Valetic who was one of the contributors to infidels.org, and he lived here in Oak Park. And I spent hours and hours talking to him, and I had done some internet stuff, and I thought I'd seen everything, but I had never experienced the level of scrutiny that you get from a guy who has a master's degree in theology and knows Greek and Hebrew. And Bryan.
You're talking about Bryan right now.
Yeah, I'm talking about Bryan. Bryan is incredibly smart, and I was no match for his questions. And Bryan really has a gift at poking at the deep questions where most people will only deal on the surface.
So he's poking at the deep questions because where we left off, he was poking at the deep questions of Young Earth Creationist.
Right.
And he starts thinking, what else are they not telling me?
Right.
So what else does he start questioning?
Well, that's like a whole nother conversation, but he's got questions about the inspiration of the Bible, the authorship of the Bible, which books we have. He's got questions about miracles. He's like, there's no miracles. That was a whole conversation, which we don't have time to go into right now, but it's very interesting. I mean, all kinds of stuff. And so the emails are going back and forth for probably a couple years. Well, then I go visit him in China. Mm-hmm. And when I get to China and we start having these conversations, it was like, whoa, he has moved way further in his, like, he's already thrown this out the window. Woo, like, I didn't realize this. I didn't realize how far he had got in his doubt. He's already thrown this out the window. Mm-hmm. And this really shook me up. Hey man, this is my brother, and so we're riding in this little bus, and I find myself retreating to what I am comfortable with, and I'm almost learning something about myself in the process, and I go, Bryan, look at the hand at the end of your arm. I said, this is a nice piece of engineering, and I'm an engineer. Like, you don't think this is an accumulation of random accidents, do you? And he's like, hold on. And he says, listen, if there's a billion falcons flying around for a million years, that's a lot of falcons, Perry. I'm like, yeah, that's a lot of falcons. And he goes, if one of them gets a random copying error in its DNA and its eyesight improves, then it outhunts the other falcons, and then the falcons get better. And you don't need a designer. You only need mutation and selection. No designer necessary. And I listened to that. Now, I had been down the cosmology rabbit hole. I had not gone down the evolution rabbit hole. And I didn't really know anything about this. All I knew was my instinctive engineer intuition. Like, man, I could study the hand for the rest of my life and I could learn engineering stuff. So I sense God in nature, however that works. Like, and Bryan is now challenging this, and he's saying, no, all you need is randomness and selection, and you get a hand. And I'm like, okay, I'm not sure I agree, but like trying to be 5 chess moves ahead, I already know that most biologists would more likely agree with him than me. Mm-hmm. How do I know I'm right? There's lots of stuff in science that's counterintuitive, and this might be one of those things. So, and I just thought, I am going to stop arguing with Bryan about this, and I am going to go home and I'm going to figure this out. because I have an engineering degree. I'm scientifically literate. Most people would get lost in this, but I think I can maneuver this without getting lost. Here we go. And because he had already kind of like drugged me under the water. I was already drowning.
In doubt now?
Yeah. Like, I'm not nearly as far as he is, and there's a lot of things we haven't covered, but I had a lot of questions, and I knew he was asking good questions. I knew that my belief system was more or less grounded in the Mr. G church. I was like, well, I don't know. Is Christianity going to hold up? I'm going to put stuff on the anvil, and I'm going to start pounding on it.
Was your initial goal to basically win the battle with Bryan, or was it just to find the answers for yourself at this point?
It was for me. It was much more for me than him. In fact, as I started to get answers about evolution and science, Bryan became disinterested. Bryan had already made up his mind to at least be an agnostic. And he didn't want to argue about this anymore. And so he saddled me with all these questions, and then he kind of walled off. And so now it's like, don't do that to me. It's like, now what? And so, like, if I had gotten what I really wanted at the time, it would have been, I'm going to argue with Bryan. Bryan can argue as hard as he wants. One of us will convince the other. I think I can probably convince him, and then I can go back to being a regular Christian again. But that's not what happened. Bryan doesn't want to talk about this, and I'm really not sure if any of what I believe is right. And so I'm like, I'm going to let science make this decision for me, because if random accidents can make a hand, then I should be able to verify this. There should be some engineering principle or something. They sure didn't teach me anything like this in electrical engineering school, I can tell you that. But at any rate, I'm going to figure this out, and then I'm going to take whatever I find, and I'm going to put it on a public anvil, and I'm going to let people pound on it. Because I had one and eventually two websites that were basically apologetics oriented. I had one called Coffee House Theology, and then eventually I had one called Cosmic Fingerprints. And what I was really trying to do for myself with these sites was, I'm going to take what I believe, I'm going to put it in front of people, I'm going to invite them to pound on it, and I'm going to see if they can destroy it. Does it hold up or does it break? Okay, well, so I learned a lot from this. First, I learned that there was an awful lot of things that churches will try to put out there that you couldn't really defend. But I found out there's other things that you can defend. There's other things that nobody can break if they pound on them hard enough. So, like, I don't want to get into a version here, but for example, there is no coherent, widely accepted, alternative explanation for the resurrection. There's not. There's a million little fragmented theories, none of which fit neatly together. There's no coherent explanation for this is what happened that explains all the evidence and everything that we have. Like, the resurrection holds together pretty well, right? Or my DNA is a code thing, which that gets ahead of myself. But I would put this stuff and people would pound it on it. And what this did for me was, this said 20% of Christian theology is 80% of what's important. And 1% of Christian theology is 50% of what's important. And the other stuff is majoring on minors, and it's really dangerous.
So during all of this with Bryan, did things ever get rocky in your guys' relationship?
They got a little strained. But actually, he moved back to the United States shortly after that bus argument and took a job working for my company. He's co-author of our Google AdWords book. And so, we managed to like buffer things and like just not be constantly arguing all the time. There's a point where you realize that it's just not good for a relationship to be like pounding away on this. And so now I'm needing to go spar with other people, which is probably a lot healthier. And so I did something which was pretty unusual. I don't really know anybody else who's done anything to this depth. So the way that my websites were put together, people would sign up for these email sequences like 7 Great Lies of Organized Religion or whatever, and the replies would come back to me, and I would see, can I actually defend this? And if somebody's going to poke a hole in this, like, I'm going to find them. So what I started doing, I started buying Google traffic, which at the time was really cheap. It's pretty expensive now, but most people hadn't figured out Google AdWords, and I did, and I wrote a book on it. So I'm driving all these clicks from all over the world to these websites, and people are signing up, and if people reply to an email, I get the email. And I basically decided I will take on any reasonable person. I will ignore no verifiable truth. And I'm just going to put this out there. And if somebody can prove me wrong, I will change my mind. And I don't care what it is. And sooner or later, I'm going to find out, does this thing hold up or does it fall apart? Because I thought I knew before all this stuff with Bryan. Now I'm not so sure. And so here they come. And over a period of several years, I had 250,000 people sign up for these emails.
Wow.
Okay. There was 75,000 on one list and 175,000 on the science list. And like, here they come. And I'll take all comers. And it was like, like, if you can show me that something's wrong, then I will chisel it off and I won't believe that anymore. And what this had effect was doing was narrowing and narrowing. It's like there's a small number of things that nobody can seem to overturn. And so as I went down the rabbit hole of, okay, can an accumulation of random accidents combined with selection make a hand? Mm-hmm. Is that true or not? I started taking my discoveries and putting them on that website and in those emails and seeing, can anybody break this apart?
Sure. And you're coming at this from a science-based perspective at this point?
Well, yeah. So the 7 Great Lies of Religion series, which still exists, you can go sign up for it. That was like a theology kind of approach. But where did the universe come from was a science approach. So where did the universe come from? Where did all this fine-tuning come from? Where does the information in DNA come from? How does evolution work? And see, remember what I said about, like, if you have a geologist who drills for oil, his paycheck doesn't come from theories about the age of the earth. His paycheck comes from how good are you at drilling for oil. So I was looking for stuff like that. Like, if something is true, people from all kinds of religious backgrounds or irreligious backgrounds should be able to verify that it's true. Like, there's no reason why there should be a special Christian version of science and then an everybody else version of science. Mm-hmm. Science being the way that it is, being experimental and all that. Like, you ought to be able to figure stuff out. And so I went down that rabbit hole, and now I was really scared at first. Like, I didn't know where this was going to end up. I thought, okay, so Bryan's already, maybe he's not quite an atheist, but he's close. And like, what happens if I flip? Like, how's this going to affect me and my family? Like, is my wife going to take the kids to church? Are we going to have arguments about, well, Perry, you only say so much about all your doubts to the kids because, we could be having that argument. Thanksgiving dinner could get really interesting with the relatives. Maybe Bryan and I are going to like smirk at each other while everybody prays to their invisible sky daddy, or the flying spaghetti monster. I mean, who knows? I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I know I'm going to follow the evidence wherever it leads, and I'm going to ignore no verifiable fact. So here we go.
Was there ever a spot where you were like scared that you were like going to slip off the faith edge all the way?
Yeah. But I just knew I couldn't be a hypocrite. I couldn't believe one thing on Sunday and then believe a different thing on Monday and just kind of, smooth it over, which a lot of people do. I couldn't do that. All right, just want to know the truth. So yeah, I was scared, and I felt, I almost felt the maw of the beast on my neck. It was like, all right, dude, you got to figure this out. You got to make some sense out of all this.
Did this ever bleed in? I know you mentioned it a second ago. Did it ever end up bleeding into the family?
Well, Laura knew that I was going through this, and she knew that there wasn't anything she could do but give me her space. I mean, did this bother her? Yes. But she knew there wasn't anything she could do to talk me out of it. This was over her head. I mean, she's a very smart person. She was a National Merit Scholar in school. She got a full tuition scholarship to college. She has an economics degree. But, I mean, if I was drowning in Bryan's questions, she wasn't going to be able to solve them. And so, all right. So she just gave me space.
That's great.
She was nervous. She was.
Yeah. Was there any conversation about just what you said, like kids around the table?
No, because I hadn't gotten to the point of throwing it out like Bryan had. I just knew it could happen. And I knew I was less and less, there was a whole list of things that I was just less and less sure about. So, I just had to go through it. And nobody could do it for me, and nobody could do my thinking for me.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, and I would talk to all kinds of people. I mean, I would go to Willow Creek. We had this thing called Truth Quest that met every month, and it was like the apologetics people. Now, in a city the size of Chicago, when you have an apologetics thing that meets every month, and you get 8 million people within an hour, you get a lot of smart people showing up. And a lot of these questions were over their heads.
Mm-hmm.
But I had to do this. And again, I had to let science make the decision for me, because, okay, so is Bryan right about the hand and the falcons and stuff? And I knew that I should be able to figure this out. I knew this from an acoustics paper I wrote in college, where I kind of had to get to the very bottom of the proverbial swamp before I could piece the problem together. And I did. I figured it out. And once I got to the core fundamental principles, and then I could build on top of that, and then I solved the problem. And I knew what it felt like. And what I knew was I had not gotten to the bottom of the swamp in the evolution question.
Mm-hmm.
That for a while I was just watching the ping pong ball go back and forth between the left and the right. When, that kind of makes sense. Oh, but that kind of makes sense. Oh, but that kind of makes sense. And, it was kind of like this sadistic entertainment, watching them take pounds of flesh out of each other. But I had to get past all that. I had to get down to real scientific books and literature.